It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Professor Peter Navarro has a PhD in economics from Harvard University. He's also a professor right here at the University of California at Irvine. And besides, over and above his credentials as an economist, one of the great skills that he brings is that he's a great communicator. And this shows up in the fact that he's an author of numerous best-selling books, among which are If It's Raining in Brazil, Buy Starbucks, and also The Well-Timed Strategy, Managing the Business Cycle for Competitive Advantage. He's also been written up in numerous popular publications, and among these are Barron's, Business Week, the LA Times, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Harvard Business Review. He was recently called to testify before the House Ways and Means Committee on tonight's very topic. And now we consider that he's called to speak before the Inside Edge on his latest book, which is The Coming China Wars, Where They Will Be Fought, How They Will Be Won. Let's welcome Professor Peter Navarro.
Well, you know the Harvard joke, right? You can tell a Harvard man, you just can't tell him much. Hey, I'm delighted to be here, and it's a real pleasure. This is a great group to talk to. I've got good news and bad news for you, okay? The good news is, in addition to my speaking before you, we have book TV here from C-SPAN. That's the good news. The bad news is, when we go to the Q&A period, you got to have really good questions. You're going to look really foolish. What I'm going to do today is talk about the book, The Coming China Wars, Where They Will Be Fought, How They Will Be Won. What I'm going to do is basically deal with the idea that the emergence of China as an economic superpower is creating a number of conflicts between China and the rest of the world, as well as within China. And I'm going to talk about a number of those, not all the ones that are in the book, but I'm going to feature a number of those. I'm going to start with the war over jobs and market share. This is the whole issue that China has become the factory floor of the world. And since 2001, America has lost over 2 million manufacturing jobs to the Chinese. With every one manufacturing job goes to 3 or 4 service jobs. So this has been a significant kind of impact. You know, all's fair in some sense in economic growth, but the problem is, and one of the things I'm going to feature when I talk about that particular conflict, is the fact that China cheats. And I'm going to discuss the results of a year-long study done right here on the Irvine campus that illustrates the various ways that China uses mercantilist policies right out of the 19th century, basically, to gain unfair competitive advantage over the U.S. and Europe and others. You've heard, of course, currency manipulation. That's been in the news, but there's some other things going on. So we're going to tackle that one. The second one we're going to talk about is the oil wars. $70 a barrel oil and counting. There's concerns now we're on our way to $100 a barrel in oil. There's concerns now that we're in a world where we have essentially a permanent oil price shock, where we'll be paying $3, $4 a gallon for gasoline on into the future. The U.S. is certainly guilty of pushing that along because we consume a fair amount of the oil, about 25% of the oil in the world with 4% of the population. But China's emergence into that market has really been a shock to the system. And what I'm going to explain when we talk about the oil wars essentially is China's quest for oil is putting it particularly into direct conflict with the U.S., both economically and geopolitically and strategically and possibly down the road militarily. Related to oil, there's also the commodities wars, the natural resource wars. China, it's really hard to get your head around China, but some of the statistics that will help you along are something like this. China uses half of the world's cement. They use a third of its steel, a fourth of its copper, and look at this, your mouth is wide open, Lynetta. It's amazing. It really is. I mean, fifth of the world's aluminum. I mean, it's hard to kind of grasp that. Every week, every week they build a new coal-fired power plant. Every week. San Onofre, down the road, how many times have you passed that? Imagine building one of those equivalent a week, every week of the year. They build enough coal power plants every year to light the entire British Isles. Okay? And so in the quest for fueling what is essentially a heavy manufacturing model, China is having to go out all over the world, particularly to Africa and Latin America, to look for resources. What I'm going to talk about, particularly when I talk about the resource wars, commodity wars, is how China is using a model of imperialism, essentially, to ensnare African and Latin American countries into what's going to be a very unhealthy economic development in the world's poorest areas. So, oil, commodities. We're going to talk about also environmental pollution. China, 16 of the world's 20th dirtiest cities are in China. All of its rivers are severely polluted. I'm going to talk about, there's just, I don't know, how many, see the level of international sophistication here. How many subscribe to the Financial Times in this room? Yeah, okay, well, we're sort of sophisticated. To me, that's the best paper in the world right now if you're interested in international issues. The front page today was how a report was just issued that says that every year 20 million Chinese will fall ill because of pollution and 600,000 of them will die. And interestingly enough, the Chinese government was able to suppress the portion of the report which will be released publicly that deals with the morbidity or death statistics. Okay? It's happening, it's real. But the big point that I'll make when I talk a little bit more about that is the fact that this pollution is spilling over their borders into Japan, into Korea. When you go into Walmart and you walk out of Walmart with your bag or box of cheap Chinese goods, and you look up into the air, some of that brown air may well be from Asia. Rides the jet stream right over very efficiently, and here it comes. We are all breathing essentially the same air. Time permitting, I'm also going to try to talk a little bit about what is an epidemic now of counterfeiting and contaminated and defective products. I'm sure you've all been following the news. We've got toys with lead paint. We've got toothpaste laced with antifreeze, which the last time I looked wasn't one of the 4 major food groups, by the way. Tires they send over here that can kill a family of 4 in an SUV faster than they're drunk on a Saturday night. Basically, they left out a key component of the tire, cuts the tire life in half. They explode at about 20,000 miles. And if you happen to be making a wrong turn, literally, it might be your last turn. So we'll get to that if we have time. And then the most favorite part of any talk I ever give is the questions. And again, that's when the pressure of book TV is going to be squarely on Glennetta's shoulders and everybody else in this room. So anyway, before I talk about all of those coming China wars, I do, however, want to talk a little bit about how and why I wrote the book, because I think that's always kind of useful to people when they kind of get a behind-the-scenes look at how these things evolve. And really, this book started for me close to 35 years ago, right after I graduated from college in Boston, a little place called Tufts, and I joined the Peace Corps. And I had a really hardship post. I went to Thailand. That's funny if you know Thailand. And anybody who was a Peace Corps volunteer, there were some places you could go and you'd be like really sick and emaciated the whole time. Thailand was a really nice place to be. I had no complaints about it. But one of the things about Thailand is they have more holidays than a Hallmark card factory. I mean, it's amazing. And what was interesting about that, because I spent 3 years there, during those holiday times, I was always able to travel. So during that time, I traveled virtually throughout Southeast Asia. And one of the enduring lessons of the time, and this was in the 70s, was how thoroughly overseas Chinese had embedded themselves in the entrepreneurial sector of all of these countries. Essentially, then and now, overseas Chinese run the countries of most of Southeast Asia. The one exception, of course, is Burma, which threw out the Chinese and the Indians and other ethnic groups and kind of closed themselves in. But virtually every other country is run at the business level by Chinese. And it struck me at the time that how ironic where you have a people who are so good at doing business basically alongside a country, mainland China, which essentially had expropriated all property and wiped out essentially all kinds of entrepreneurship. Of course, since the 1990s, that entrepreneurship has come back in full force, and we're dealing with that now. But that's where my whole thoughts about internationalization and the Chinese and how things work. And this whole, that book title that you laughed at, if it rains in Brazil, buy Starbucks. What that means, that book was actually an investment book. And what it means is that if it rains to break a drought in Brazil, coffee beans will be cheaper. And if coffee beans are cheaper, Starbucks will make more money every time they sell a cup of coffee, because the one thing we know about Starbucks is they never lower their price, right? And if their prices, if their profits go up, their stock prices go up. So if it rains in Brazil, buy Starbucks. And that kind of thinking, that's the kind of thinking I try to cultivate in my students when I talk about macroeconomics, the kind of thinking I want to share with you tonight when you think about how something going on in a country 7,000 miles away could really affect you right at your doorstep. So let's start with the first war, the big war, the one that all the countries of the world are fighting now, the war over jobs and economic base. I mean, the whole idea, if you're going to have prosperity in a country, you need people working, and you need people working at good wages. And there's a term that was coined by a cover issue of Business Week some years ago, about going on 4 years ago now, called the China price. Anybody ever heard that term, the China price? You know what it means? It refers to the fact that Chinese manufacturers can undercut the price of foreign competitors by 50% or more across a wide range of goods. It's incredible. And I'm at a business school, I teach macroeconomics, and it's like, I got to figure out how they do this. Because starting in about the year 2001, the China price became a fact of life for everybody in business. And it's one set of facts if it's simply a country with a cheap labor, a well-disciplined workforce, and an ability basically to produce at a lower cost. It's quite another thing, however, if that competitive advantage is derived from essentially unfair trading practices. So what I did with a group of about 100 MPA students, we spent a year looking at the drivers of the China price. And what we discovered were there were eight of these things. And one of them, of course, was cheap, well-disciplined labor. But that was only about a third to 40% of the equation. There was these other things going on. And so one of them is what's called currency manipulation. What the China, this is where we get a little bit of technical and your eyes might glaze over, but work with me on this, because you need to understand this, because it affects you and your kids and your grandkids and everybody here in this country. The idea is this: China pegs their currency to the dollar. It doesn't float freely. It's just locked in to the dollar. And what's supposed to happen is if the U.S. over here runs big trade deficits with the Chinese, you're supposed to get a bunch of excess dollars over in China. The Chinese currency is supposed to strengthen, the U.S. dollar is supposed to weaken, and trade's supposed to come back into balance. Okay? But they don't let that happen. And the way they don't let that happen is they take a lot of our excess dollars that we spend in Walmart that go over to China, and they bring them right back across the pond, and they buy U.S. government treasuries. China has, again, this is the scale and scope of things, China has $1 trillion of foreign reserves right now. And $800 billion of those reserves are estimated to be in U.S. government paper. Now, what that does for us is a really nice thing. It keeps interest rates really low and mortgage rates low. And over the past 6 or 7 years, it's helped fuel a housing boom around this country, and particularly here in Orange County. And the joke there, of course, is, I turn to my wife and say, hon, I always wanted to live in $1 million home, just didn't think it would be this one. Thank you, China, for that. But China's doing that not because they want to keep our mortgage interest rates low or interest rates low. China's doing that because they want to keep stuffing the supply chain of Walmart with goods so that they can keep, essentially, their people employed. Okay? And what currency manipulation does is acts as a giant tariff on U.S. exports and as a giant subsidy to Chinese imports into this country. And the problem is that we're running a $250 billion trade deficit with China. Those are big numbers. 25% of our deficit is with China, trade deficit. But if you X out oil and you just look at goods, it's about 50%. I mean, it's huge. It's huge. And that translates into the loss of jobs. And we're not doing so bad here out in California. The coast, it's like Long Beach loves it. You go up on across the 73 toll road, and you look out in the ocean. You can see those tankers lined up into Long Beach, and San Francisco's doing pretty good. But you know what? You go to Detroit, the housing market in Detroit, I mean, that place looks like ground zero. There's things going on here. It's not just loss of jobs, it's also downward pressure on the wages. Currency manipulation. The other things we found out were blatant violations of the World Trade Organization rules. China joined the WTO in 2001, and basically that gave them carte blanche to get into our markets. Okay? They promised to abide by the rules. But if you're a Chinese businessman, got John here. Suppose, John, I say, you want to open a business here in Guangzhou, okay, southern China. I'll give you subsidized electricity and water rates. I'll give you free land. I'll loan you a bunch of money. And by the way, if you have any trouble paying it back, you don't have to. You think you could do business that way? I think you could probably do business that way. So, currency manipulation, export subsidies, counterfeiting and piracy. I won't ask you all to admit whether you have a counterfeit Louis Vuitton bag or a guy. Whoever went to China and picked up a Steven Spielberg movie for $1 on a DVD that was counterfeit. Okay? But the message to you that I want to give you is that it's not just those things. It's literally A to Z. Auto parts, batteries, condoms, elevators, refrigerators, Zippo lighters. If we're making it here in the U.S., they're faking it. And from, again, a competitive advantage, what does counterfeiting and piracy do for an entrepreneur in China? They don't have to pay research and development. They don't have to pay marketing. And they don't have to pay information technology or IT expenses because they just take the software. Okay? So it gives them an edge. And, of course, the fourth and fifth portions of the China price are the laxest health and safety and environmental regulations in the world. And, again, if you're not putting scrubbers on your coal power plant, if you're not giving your workers safety equipment, you're saving money, and that gives you an unfair advantage. So in this war, the U.S. is losing this badly, but you know who's getting hurt worse? It's the Mexicos and the Cambodias of this world, because China is, as many jobs as are moving out of here, those developing countries are getting hurt even more so. So that's something we're going to have to deal with at some point. And if for no other reason, then we can't keep giving the Chinese in excess of $70 billion a month on our trade deficit. Okay? By the time 20 years from now, we'll be in hock to them, and we won't basically have any claim to assets. So that's one we have to flag. Now, let's segue over to oil. I remember the 70s and the oil embargoes. Does anybody know who was the first country to slap an oil embargo on another country? U.S. against Japan. How many of you are shocked? The United States was the first country to ever issue an oil embargo. They did it with Britain against the Japanese prior to World War II to basically try to force the Japanese out of Southeast Asia in terms of Malaysia taking rubber, things like that. Okay? And there are a lot of people who think that that single act was responsible for Pearl Harbor because in cutting off Japan's oil, basically, it set the clock when they would essentially run out and not be able to wage war. So Japan had to either totally capitulate or they had to fight. And we know how that one went. The reason why that history is relevant here is that China has a keen sense of its vulnerability to oil supply disruptions. I mean, look, this is a country of 1.4 billion people. There's about 4 times as many people on a landmass roughly the same size as the U.S. Okay? And they have about 500 million people on farms that they want to move into factories over the next 20 years. Now, to put that in perspective, the number of people China wants to move off the farms into factories right now is more than the current workforces of the U.S. and Europe combined. Okay? And that doesn't even take into account the people who are working. It's the ones they want to get to work. Okay? All of that's going to be driven by oil. And unlike the U.S. or Japan, China doesn't have a strategic petroleum reserve. They only have about 10 days' supply of oil. So they're very vulnerable. And their oil has to come through 2 very dangerous places, the Straits of Hormuz in the Middle East and the Malacca Straits, which separate the Indian and Pacific Oceans. So what China is doing very, very, very aggressively is trying to lock down oil reserves all over the world. And it's very different from the strategy of the U.S. What the U.S. does basically is rely on markets. They basically want to contract with people. They buy oil, they do futures, they do things like that. No problem. World oil markets. What China likes to do is go to a country and say, hey, we want these reserves, we'll give you X. And what that does is it takes it out of the market. Okay? It's a very confrontational strategy. Now, again, there's a couple ways of looking at it. You can say, well, look, they've got as much right to that oil as we do. After all, we use a lot more than they do proportionally to our needs, and it's their time to develop. You can look at it that way. Fine, I'm sympathetic to that view, but here's the problem that I have with the way China's going about securing their oil resources. One of the favorite things China likes to do, basically, is to cut deals with countries that wind up creating havoc with the rest of the world. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Darfur. We know about the situation in Darfur. The genocide going on in Darfur. For years now, the United Nations has been trying to crack down on that situation, send in peacekeeping forces, trying to get that under control. The single greatest reason why there has been no resolution to that conflict is China. What China has been doing in the Sudan is using their position with a seat on the UN Security Council. They have a permanent seat, so they have a veto. They basically trade their veto for oil. Now, I can't think of anything more despicable than that. And this is something that's been written about rather extensively, but it always boggles my mind that more isn't made of that. But that's a typical kind of deal. Another kind of typical deal is a deal that they've been cutting with Iran. Iran is not our friend. Iran is not the Middle East friend. Iran is not Israel's friend. Iran is not the friend of Sunnis in Iraq. It's a very dangerous country at this point in time with the leadership that's there. And China has been supplying Iran for many years now with the nuclear technology that they have been using to develop a nuclear weapons capability, as well as conventional weapons. And there's reports now, for example, that ammunition from China is finding its way into Iraq, killing our people and Iraqis from Iran. Okay? What Iran also has, besides a lot of grief for the world, is one of the largest natural gas reserves in the world, as well as significant oil reserves. And what China has very artfully and skillfully done is leveraged its exchange of things like weapons and nuclear technology for the rights to develop those natural gas fields. Latin America, Hugo Chavez, the elected leader of Venezuela. We get a lot of our oil from Venezuela. What China has done is they've already gone in and locked down much of the future oil production of Venezuela. So the point is that it's very, very confrontational. And the last icing on that cake is China's development of what's called a deepwater navy. There's only one deepwater navy in the world. That's the United States Navy. China is aggressively developing their own deepwater navy with aircraft carriers, nuclear-equipped subs, which now can hit the U.S. with ballistic missiles, and very sophisticated Soviet ships. So that's going to be with us for quite a long time. And I don't know how that one is going to be resolved. A natural segue from the oil wars is the whole natural resource and commodity wars. I mean, I expect there's a few people in here, stock market investors, might have made a bundle over the last 3 or 4 years speculating on commodities. I mean, the price of commodities has just been on a tear. And as I said earlier, China, with its heavy manufacturing model, is driving that to a large extent. Here's the dark side of China's strategy to get those resources. Basically, China is very, very active in all 54 African countries. China has had a presence in Africa going back to the 70s when it was there for ideological purposes. And I don't know if some of you remember, there was a lot of wars going on in Africa where the Soviets and the U.S. and China had proxy fighters, and the Cubans were in there on the Soviet side. It was just kind of a mess. But during that time, China developed relationships with a lot of young idealists who now have become middle-aged pragmatists running government. And the typical deal that China cuts in Africa is to come in and say, hey, we'll build you X. Now, X can be, in the best of circumstances, it can be roads and bridges and maybe a train system. In the worst of circumstances, it can be presidential palaces and armed forces for dictators. But what China does is they loan these nations a bunch of money and build their infrastructure. They bring in teams of engineers and workers, build a lot of this infrastructure. That's all good. Okay? But it's a devil's bargain, because basically what China is doing is building an infrastructure to extract the natural resources of the country, to take back to China, turn into finished goods, and then bring back to the world, including those countries, to sell at cheap prices. Okay? And the way the typical deal is structured is, it's like I give you the money, you sign deals, essentially, that give us rights to develop your natural resources, and bilateral market deals which give us access to your markets. And this, I mean, look, again, I'm a macroeconomist. That's macro is about jobs, recession, depression, inflation, things like that. It's like the worst possible model for development in Africa is one in which all you do is get rid of your natural resources for cash, which goes to a few of the elites, which then goes to Swiss bank accounts. And it's happening all over Africa right now. The best model of development is for these countries to be able to use those natural resources to develop their own indigenous industries, build finished goods, and then send them to the world. But that's not what's happening. That's happening in Africa. It's happening in Latin America. And the G7, which is the group of the developed nations that meet, I'm sure you've heard of that, as well as the OECD, are very, very concerned about this. So this, again, this is one of the wars. I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I know the direction it's going, and it's not going in a direction particularly good for Africa, and to a lesser extent, but a significant extent, Latin America. All right. We've done jobs, we've done oil, we've done commodities and natural resources. let's talk a little bit about the environment. Just last month, China surpassed the United States as what? The biggest global warmer, the biggest emitter of carbon dioxide. We've been the biggie, but China just surpassed us. And what was interesting about that is they did it about 3 or 4 years faster than anybody thought they would. That's how fast they're growing. And on that note, by the way, 3 decades, GDP growth rate 10% a year roughly, doubled the size of their economy 3 times. Okay? By comparison, we grow about 3%, bigger base of course, but we grow about 3% GDP. Europe about 2. Okay? They're just flying. Okay? Now, as I said, they have this heavy manufacturing model. That's what they've wedded themselves to. Very different from India. Very different from India. India's got big population. India's economy is growing, not as fast as China, but it's growing robustly. We know what India does. They do high tech and they do services. Right? Some manufacturing, but nothing like China. Now, again, we need to do scale and scope here. You go to China, it's like, hey, I went to China. Where'd you go? Oh, I went to Beijing. Went to Shanghai. Took a nice trip down the Three Gorges Dam River. Yeah, it's great. Wonderful. Yeah. Okay, well, I guess you didn't go to China. China has over 100 cities. Over 100 cities with 1 million people or more. China, as I said earlier, 16 of the 20 dirtiest cities in the world. How many have been to Beijing? Yeah, well, you know, I mean, you feel it here, you can't see that much. And the thing about China, well, in the rivers, let's talk, I need to lay out the stats for the rivers too, because the rivers, they get 7 major rivers. Every one of them is significantly to severely polluted, and the coastal seas. I mean, the place, it's just, I mean, it's a tragedy. It's what I call it in the China Wars book, a global tragedy of the commons. Okay? And there's an epidemic of cancers and diseases in the countryside because of all this. As I said at the outset, the latest reports 600,000 people are going to die a year, 20 million are going to get sick. Okay? But put that all aside. I mean, there's going to be the hard-hearted conservatives who say, hey, you know what? If China wants to pollute and sell us cheap goods, that's their problem. We'll buy the cheap goods. The problem here is that pollution doesn't know borders. Okay? One of the interesting things about China that you may not know is that a lot of it's desert. Did you know that? It's significant. About 40% of China out in the western port is desert. Now, it's not natural desert. Some of it was natural desert. But going back as far as 5,000 years ago, there's people in China who have written about how the land has been destroyed by overpopulation and overgrazing and overuse. Okay? And one of the things that China's tried to do to tame the West, because the West is kind of this area where there's a lot of ethnic groups, they've done this strategy called the Hanification of that area, which means they send out ethnic Chinese into that area. They get them to develop what's generally steppe land. Okay? It's not farmland. And they plow it, they try to plant, and it lasts about 3 years, and then it doesn't work. And then the land has lost all its natural protection, and the sand just drifts up. So you have these sandstorms. Now, first time I learned about sandstorms, I think, yeah, no big deal. But the sandstorms that they have in China now are on par with typhoons and hurricanes. These things are like really, they dump tons and tons of sand, not just on cities in China, but this stuff goes across to Japan and Korea. And they've had days in Japan and Korea where they had to close the airports, close the schools. I mean, it's really kind of horrific stuff. And in addition to that, as I said earlier, the jet stream, way up there, okay? If you imagine the heartland, the Rust Belt heartland of China, where they don't have a lot of air pollution controls, mercury and other toxins are going up in the air along with the usual carbon dioxide and all the other stuff that's in the smokestack, right? Goes up into the jet stream and very efficiently comes our way. Okay? And the other thing, which is kind of really interesting in terms of the whole climate control and pollution and global warming issue, and this gets back to my rain in Brazil by Starbucks thinking, okay? China is having a lot of trouble feeding itself right now. It was self-sufficient in grain, but as it industrializes, it's actually eating up a lot of its farmland. And it doesn't have a lot of farmland to begin with. It's not well endowed with farmland as countries go. And so, some years ago, China elevated their subsidies for growing grain. At the same time, as people are getting richer, follow me on this one, what do? They eat more meat, right? And how do you grow meat? With grain and, what's the other? Soybeans. Okay? All animal feed has about 10 or 15% soybean meal, okay? Because it's a high source of protein. Okay? Now, how does this fit into what I'm talking about? Well, okay, so we got grain subsidies, not for soybeans, but for grain, and we got rising appetites for meat. Okay? And what this has done first is reduce soybean cultivation in China. And remember, China, that's where tofu comes from. They've been eating that stuff for a while, right? But the reduction of soybean cultivation in China, coupled with the increased demand for meat and the indirect demand for soybean meal, has sparked a virtual soybean boom where? Anybody know? Not here. Not here. We grow a lot of soybeans here. In the Amazon River Basin. The Amazon River Basin in Brazil and Paraguay principally. Okay? And what we're seeing now, what we've been seeing for about a decade now, is a very, very rapid destruction of the Amazon rainforest. The way it works, first of all, there's very little property rights down there. It's kind of like a frontier mentality, and it's what laws they have are broken because of corruption. So loggers come in, and they cut the trees down, and then what do they do with the trees? They burn all of that stuff. It's a kind of a slash and burn. Sometimes they don't even cut the trees down, they just burn them. And you see these big trees are so big that they'll burn for up to a year. They'll continue to smolder for up to a year. Okay? And then once they clear the land, the ranchers come in. And then once the rancher's there, then it's time for the soybean farmers. Now, why do I mention this? Because we're talking about, if it rains in Brazil by starving, we're talking about how growth in China, government programs in China, changing appetites in China, can affect first the Amazon and then the rest of the world. What is the Amazon? People used to call it the lungs of the planet. Okay? But that was kind of a misnomer because it actually generates about as much carbon dioxide as it cleans out of the atmosphere. But what it does, what the Amazon River Basin does, scientifically, is provide a lot of rain to that continent and also some climate control. So, I mean, the question is, how long can that kind of development in China continue without destroying a large part of China itself as well as the rest of the world? So I flagged that. Now, I'm going to spend just a few minutes on the contaminated defective product issue, and then we're going to go to Q&A. tires, toys, toothpaste, we've learned about, catfish laced with antibiotics, Lipitor with no active ingredients, auto parts that are fake, brake pads. You want your kid in a school bus with fake brake pads, condoms that can break, danger of STDs. You can name just about any product, and as I said earlier, there can be a China connection and a China problem. And the question is, my favorite gross story of all time happened this last week. I don't know if you saw the pork bun scandal. Anybody see this paper? You see this? Yeah. Okay. The Chinese police busted a vendor in China who was making chow sabao, I think that's how you say it, the pork buns we all know and love, right? And they were 40% cardboard. Good high fiber diet, very regular. They asked the guy when they arrested him, well, what else is in it? And he says, oh, some fatty meat. What's going on when people in the country, let me tell you the other gross story. I got to share you with this because you have to understand the mentality, okay? There was another incident where pig farmers would take their 210-pound pig, stuff a hose down the pig's mouth, and pump in essentially 30 or 40 pounds of wastewater before shipping it off the market. Okay? How can that happen? Okay, so here's the issue. We go back to where I started here with the China price. Remember I told you about the lax regulations? I mean, there's no essential regulations there, so that's a problem. If there are regulations, they're likely to be countermanded by corruption. I don't know if you saw they recently, I don't know if the corpse is even cold yet. They just killed capital punishment the former head of the Food and Drug Administration in China for accepting bribes that led to poisonous drugs being put on the market. So, I mean, corruption is absolutely rampant. If I'm a consumer advocate, and this is my bully pulpit, this doesn't work in China. The more likely result is I'll be bullied, beaten, possibly killed. So there's no consumer advocacy. I know there's some of you out there who hate lawyers. I mean, who doesn't, right? But there's no tort system in China. You can't really sue to get your money back if they kill one of your loved ones or harm you. So there's none of that. And then, it's not like they're doing it to us. They're doing it to each other. It's just out of control. And this bureaucrat from China announced this week, very, very piously, he says, 99% of the products going into the U.S. have been found to be safe. I thought that was pretty funny. What he didn't tell you is we only inspect 1%. And the enduring fact of China is that whatever their market share is into our country, their percentage of defective products or contaminated products will be much higher. Okay? So this is, again, another issue that we're going to have to come to grips with. I regret to inform you that there's virtually no movement on any of these fronts in the Washington political establishment. They've got only one thing on their mind. It's a four-letter word, Iraq. And in my judgment, we're really ignoring one of the, I think, a threat equal or greater to not just to this country, but to China and the rest of the world by failing to see all of this unfolding before us. So now that I've got you happy, let's have some Q&A. We're going to do this. We've got one microphone here. We got one there. So let's go to this gentleman first, and then this lady here after. Can we go here? Yeah.
Professor Navarro, notwithstanding the scope, the size, and the environmental issues here, aren't you primarily, in terms of historical analysis, describing the United States and Europe in the 1890s at the time of great product liability, terrible sanitation, awful food, lousy working conditions? And it seems to me that there's an element of sour grapes in there, which is to say, well, we had our time, but the market really wasn't so big and we couldn't make as much money, and now we're behind the ball because they're the growing economy.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I hear that a lot, particularly when I go to San Francisco. For whatever reason, it's a I don't want to demean what you say, but it's a center left point of view, and it's absolutely right. It's absolutely right. But there's two differences here, which I think we have to reckon with. The first is that unlike the 19th century U.S. going to Hawaii or the Philippines or whatever, China is using 21st century technologies, and they're doing quite a bit of harm in my judgment. The second thing is that we have to deal with the here and now. And the scale and scope issue, to me, is what makes this in a totally different league with, I mean, one of the worst imperialists of all time was what the British did to China. Okay, let me just share with you that real quick. It's a quick story. Okay? Britain goes to China and wants to buy their silks and their teas and their ceramics. And they do that. And they run up huge trade deficits. And it endangers the pound. Okay? And they go, what the hell are we going to do? Can't let this go on. It'll destroy our economy. China didn't want to buy anything the British could sell them. So what did they do? They brought opium in. And that's how they balanced trade. Despicable. Okay? But you know what? Damn them. Okay? But right now we have to deal with the here and now. And to me, if China were competing fairly on the jobs issue, that would be one set of facts. But they're not. They're cheating. Currency manipulation, WT violations, no intellectual property, health and safety regulations, environmental. They're killing Chinese as well as us. I'm not going to stand for that. I don't care what my ancestors did in the Philippines. But it's a good point of view and a good question. Yeah. All right, let's go here, and then how about this gentleman here? Yeah.
Well, I'm taking a chance on this.
Okay. Remember, book TV's on you.
That's okay. One thing that you didn't mention is the human rights issue involved in the economics and what they've done, like in countries in Tibet. How does that play into the economic world with the human rights? You
know, I think that too is a very good question. It's not one that I deal with in the book, and much has been written on it. But I'm an economist. The only thing I can reflect on that's meaningful kind of in my paradigm is that essentially what you have in China is a slave labor condition for much of the country. And it's tolerated because as bad as it is in the factories of China, it's worse on the farm. Okay? But from an economic point of view, from a macroeconomic point of view, to the extent that China engages in that kind of activity, it hurts people in Kansas, it hurts people in Detroit, it hurts people in Mexico City. And when we do deals, when we do our trade deals, one of the things we always have to include are issues such as you've raised, but we're not doing that. And it's just, I mean, the problem, the central political problem here we have in America right now, and it's a very, very serious one, is that every job that American corporations offshore to China or some other country becomes less of a reason to stand up here and fight for fair trade practices. And we're witnessing a stock market right now which is just flying in America, while the people of America are not doing that well as a whole. And that's kind of the schism that we're dealing with. Who's next here? This gentleman here? And then how about down here? Yes, sir.
While I understand and agree with everything that you've said, it's also been historically proven to be a very short-sighted way of running a country or running an economy. It's a very effective short-term solution to promoting yourself. So do you feel that China understands that and has an end game in mind to bring this all more into focus, or do you think that they are running amok?
Another great question. I think that to talk about China in some kind of unilateral dimension is impossible. There is the central government of China, but within the central government, there's 2 points of view. And then beyond the central government, there's the local and regional governments, and that's really where much of the problem in China starts. I mean, the central government wants to have strong environmental laws. They want to have some kind of clampdown, but when you get out into the provinces, the local governments basically let business do pretty much anything they want. You know why? Because often the local governments are actually the businesses. That was the deal Deng Xiaoping cut. When Deng Xiaoping decided to move from a communist to a capitalist framework, the only way he could bring along the political elites was to promise them a piece of the action. And so I personally think there's a few visionaries in China who understand what's going on, but I think largely they're running amok. And it's a process that's out of control, and we need to help them get it under control. And I think it's a question of tough love. It's not a question of Hank Paulson having his every 6 month summit and basically capitulating to every Chinese demand. I mean, it's ludicrous. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, I want to thank you. I think that's probably one of the more important speeches I've heard in my whole life.
Well, thank
and
you.
I really appreciate that because it's a perspective that I have been thinking I was seeing for quite a long time. And I've never heard anyone knowledgeable on the subject talk in that way. I'm really grateful to you. So I had a question. I guess I had a comment, which is that a couple of years ago I was talking to a doctor with whom I practiced, and I was saying, you know, it's just going to be a matter of time before China nationalizes all the investment that we've made in China, and America won't be, the United States won't be ruled by by the United States any longer. He said very few Caucasians know that.
Yeah.
And it was chilling, and I think that it's general knowledge in California anyway, in the Chinese communities, that's their perspective.
Let me reflect on that. Because
but I have a question.
Oh, go ahead. Let me address that. Then we'll come right back to you with a question. Here's the way it works. It's like $1 trillion in reserves. Right now, it's going into buying treasury bills. Okay. As they move to $2 trillion in reserves, and as pressure grows on China to let their currency float upwards, they'll start to do that. But then what they do then is do what they're doing now is they've established these equity funds. And they're taking positions now in companies in the U.S. And as soon as they do that, they begin to influence decisions over things like offshoring. And then in the third stage, they simply buy the companies outright. China has enough in their reserves right now to buy one company on the Russell 2000 every day and within 8 years own the whole thing. And the Russell 2000, for those of you who don't know, that's like the creme de la creme of our small cap stocks in America that make this whole country go through the future. Go ahead.
My question was that I was really disturbed when Google was willing to relax its standard on censorship in order to get into the China market. Yeah. And it occurred to me, if China can buy censorship in China, why can't they buy censorship in the U.S. with those same dollars?
Well, I'm at a business school, and one of the tragedies of modern business schools is that they don't generally require ethics courses. There's some schools that do, but mine doesn't. And, you know, it's like when we talk about it in faculty meetings, there's some professors who kind of even look down their nose the idea of it. They say you can't teach ethics or whatever, okay? But I can tell you this, that whenever an American goes to China, they're immediately confronted with a whole portfolio of ethical issues. I mean, do you buy into the guanxi where you spread out money to get your permits and get some influence to do that? Do you knuckle under to the demands to transfer your technology, which is sensitive, possibly military technology that you're not supposed to give them, but you might be forced to if you want to enter that market? Or if you're Google or Yahoo or Microsoft, do you do what Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft all have done, which is to basically engage in self-censorship in order to be a participant in that market? And those are very, very thorny ethical issues. And it's basically the problem, you know, it's like Google goes, well, look, we got to play along because if we don't, and we're the kind of take the moral high ground, Yahoo's going to get in there and steal the whole market. Okay, that's like the ugly side of the whole thing. So, you know, the question is, you know, where's the government, where's the leadership, where's the political leadership in all of this? And the answer is, again, it's thinking about the Middle East and not China. Okay, who's next? We got, okay, yeah, go ahead.
Professor, could I ask you a question, even though I'm the mic runner?
Wow, you know, he who has the mic rules. Go ahead. But let's get somebody else going with the next, back there in the green there. Yeah, go ahead.
You alluded to it a couple of times, and I was wondering if you'd be interested in elaborating the connection between Walmart and China.
Oh, sure. In fact, one of the last time I was in China, one of the most interesting things I saw in China was not the Great Wall or the terracotta soldiers, but it was Walmart. I went to this Walmart in Dalian. It was underground, and it was so cool. I mean, it had like this whole, I don't know, it was like a football field worth of vats full of dim sum, different kinds of dim sums, frozen dim sums you could take home and stuff like that. And, you know, the question I had when I was in there is, let me see, if this is like a mirror image world, will all the products in here be American? Look, the Walmart connection is basically this. I mean, Walmart, years ago, very aggressively decided that China was the place to get their cheap goods. And they've gotten real goods, they've gotten fake goods and everything in between and stuffed them into their supply channel. They've gone over there and developed the market as well. I mean, if anybody knows how to play China for business sakes, they're doing it, okay? And they're the purveyor of the cheap Chinese goods. But look, I mean, lesson of economics is that the price of a product doesn't always reflect its social cost. Okay? And what I'm trying to do here today, and maybe not as subtle a way as I could, but explain to you that those cheap Chinese goods have some significant social costs. They raise our gas prices at the pump. They raise our military budget because we have to deal with China in places like Africa and Latin America and Iran. They raise our FDA regulatory costs because we have to increase our monitoring and policing of things. And we're not, as a country, recognizing that. And Walmart, I mean, Walmart's doing what Walmart does. And yeah, it's partly Walmart's fault, but to me, it's clearly a lack of leadership on this issue. If there's anything you got to come away with tonight, there's a lack of leadership on this issue. I mean, look at all the presidential candidates on either side of the aisle. There's only one talking about China, and he's got 1% of the vote, and he's a fringe kind of guy. And you know, Hillary won't deal with this issue. Juliana won't deal with this issue, and nobody's dealing with this issue. Sir, in the back.
First, I wanted to thank you for your book. I had the opportunity to read it over the last couple of days. I found it to be the most enlightening and perhaps scary book I've ever read. Incidentally, we have but 60 copies of it, so if you want to get one,
Be happy to sign a book for you afterwards.
Okay.
Probably with a Sharpie from China.
Mike?
No, but it's probably banned in China. Go ahead.
Yes. I'd like to make a comment and then follow it up with a question that it could be argued that China represents far more of a threat to the United States than the Nazis or Japan ever did. And I look around personally, I'm concerned. I see our Marine Corps Air Station at Tustin being converted into a shopping center selling Chinese goods.
Goods, yeah.
We may not have a military option even in this particular case. And I have an issue of seeing Bush going hand in hand to the Chinese to borrow money to wage war against them, and obviously I don't think we're going to fund that. My question is this: in light of the seriousness of this whole thing, and particularly, Nixon, as I understand, said that there would eventually be a confrontation between the U.S. and the Chinese would win. The only option we had would be to put it off as long as possible. What can we do? I mean, both militarily and in terms of really addressing this really major threat. What can we do, sir?
Well, the first thing we have to do is recognize the threat, and that's kind of my job and focus here. I mean, I just don't see us recognizing the full extent of the threat. And let's be clear about this: is that when we go in and buy cheap Chinese goods and our dollars go over to China, as fast as their economy is growing, their military budget's growing twice as fast. Okay? As fast as their economy is growing, their military budget is growing twice as fast. And I don't know if you remember last January, but one of the more chilling things China's done in recent decades was to shoot one of their own weather satellites out of the sky with a kinetic kill vehicle launched from planet Earth. And there's only one reason for them to develop anti-satellite weapons capabilities, and that's basically to render the U.S. military deaf, dumb, and blind. So, Chicken Little or Paul Revere, take your pick, but I'm trying my best here. Let's see, we had in the back this and then over here, the woman in the green. Oh, yeah, here and then there. Go ahead.
Okay. I actually just had the opportunity to come back from the Great Wall, and there's a big, huge motto up there, and I'd like your comment on it, and it says, "One dream, one world."
One dream, one world. Yeah, I guess who holds the deed? One dream, one world. Who owns the deed? It's like there's. I think this woman's comment. There's a sense of destiny and no hurry in China, and one of the flaws of the American character is that we're impatient and we're short-sighted. And when you're working against a country which has just the opposite point of view, one of the things I always like to say is don't play checkers in a chess world. And I think we're playing checkers right now. We'll go here and then over there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Since you're a macroeconomics, I'd like to address a question on macroeconomics.
Sure.
All the things that you listed today, the bad things that China has been doing. I was reflecting on our history in the United States. We've done the same things, including, peddling armaments and using Michael Porter's competitive advantage in any which way we can. And here we are, if you look at it as we stand here now, we are a consumption society, completely consumption society. We've hollowed out our manufacturing base, and we are completely skewed to the military-industrial complex, which has a tremendous influence in the government. So with this kind of nexus, what do you expect? The Chinese kids, my kids want to go surfing and dancing. The Chinese kids want to go studying and learn the technical skills.
Yeah, here at UCI
So what?
Yeah.
How can you blame? How can we blame China?
This is a good question, and it's reflective of this gentleman's earlier observations. And again, I totally agree with what both you gentlemen are saying with it on one level. But let's do this. Let's forget about the U.S. for a minute. And let's just put ourselves in the shoes of a Mexican or somebody from Zambia or Zimbabwe or the Congo who's trying to get a higher standard of living and is dealing essentially with a juggernaut that's using unfair trade practices and imperialistic practices to suppress the economic dreams of those people who are not out surfing. They're just scratching the earth. So, I mean, let's not be U.S.-centric about this issue. It isn't about the U.S. ultimately. I mean, U.S. has to be a player in dealing with China, but so does Europe, so does Brazil, so does Africa, and so does Australia and Japan, whatever. All I can tell you is that the direction things are moving, it's going to be, well, I mean, the dedication in my book is probably the most eloquent thing in the book. It's to the children. And what I'm trying to avert here is essentially a catastrophe triggered by a set of economic events that are, echoing an earlier comment, running a bit amok. Okay, now we're here and then there. Yeah, okay, here and there. Okay,
yeah.
We'll go till we stop. No problem.
I used to live in Hong Kong. I worked for 3 years with the Chinese, with a Swiss company, so I used to go to China all the time. And there was a great respect because they were just brilliant. They were somewhat like predators. They really bought a lot of our technology so they could use it, and then when they didn't need us, we were gone. It's been coming for a long time, and this goes back years. So none of this surprises me. What I think a couple of other things is going on simultaneously is that the social contract or the nation state called the United States somehow is crumbling or breaking down or needs a great deal of assistance to it itself. And that just the very fact that basically our entire focus is on Iraq when all these very important things are going on is indication of the actual population itself, sort of a head in the sand syndrome. And the other idea is that we've become basically a world combined with nation states and corporations running the show. And we actually do have power if we would actually even recognize what's happening. And I appreciate your voice here tonight because I think that Americans need to wake up. Americans need to pay attention to something other than abortion or these other sidebars that really have nothing to do with what's going on. But they are I really enjoyed working with the Chinese, and part of the reason part of the game is to go against the rules. They love going against the rules in all areas of their lives, and it's actually a compliment to them to be able to do that. So it's such a very cultural thing, and we need to understand and have patience with ourselves as they have with themselves. They can wait forever. They will wait forever.
And you described it, it's very eloquent comments you're making. You describe it so well. It's like in Hong Kong. When I was in the Peace Corps back in the 70s, when I first visited there, they were like the China of today in the poorer parts of China. We're making textiles and doing really low-tech kind of jobs. But what's happened in the interim is that Hong Kong has become the center of capital and managerial expertise and supply chain expertise, and they go out into Guangzhou and basically help the Chinese there. And as you so eloquently put it, even the people from Hong Kong, the Chinese from Hong Kong, as soon as the Chinese in Guangzhou figure the game out, they don't need the Hong Kong people anymore, and they just go on their way. I mean, a typical scenario: American or a European goes over with a product to build. They go to a factory in Guangzhou. They give them the specs. The factory says, "All right, we'll make them." Factory runs 2 8-hour shifts, makes the contract. They run an extra 8-hour shift. They ship that stuff out the back door, and they put that on the market as a pirated good. All right, who's next? Sir.
When you spoke of the China wars, you inferred this, and that is that the population of China, as I understand it, approximately 60% is of breeding age, and they're breeding now, and in their breeding, they are going to double their population in the next.
Let me stop you there because I think that's fundamentally wrong. In fact, the problem in China is in some sense just the opposite. The effects essentially of the one-child policy that was adopted some decades ago has been to create a demographic skew where within about 15 to 20 years, China is going to get old before it gets rich. And that's part of one of the chapters I deal with something called the wars within. Basically, one of the parts of the market reforms was to wipe out their pension and healthcare systems. So they're facing a real crisis in terms of that particular issue. And they call it the 1-2-4 problem. We're going forward in time. There's going to be one child to support two parents or four grandparents. Okay. So if you have a specific question, fire away. But let's not go any further along that line, if that's okay.
You've answered it. Great.
Okay. All right. Now. I'll stay here as long as you want, but he flashed me the time signal. Who's in charge here? How much longer do we want to go here? What? Take 4 more questions? Sure. All right, let's do 4 more questions, okay? And we have one mic in hand, and you pick. I don't want to get in trouble here. Go ahead.
I was able to visit China in 1982, and I remember going through the historical museums, and what was amazing is China would go along, then there'd be a massive revolution, then there'd be another dynasty or whatever. And the whole history over thousands and thousands of years has been this revolution and then government, et cetera. Yeah. It's really quite remarkable. Is there any possibility in this that there's going to be a cycle where the human rights issues are so severe? The New York Times Magazine section had an article about one of the bigger cities. The number of women that have to be prostitutes to make a living, it's really ugly. The social issues in these huge cities, might there be enough internal unrest to derail this?
I have 2 chapters in the coming China wars on that specific issue. Okay, and let me just give you kind of an overview of what the touch points are politically. In terms of the demonstrations, they've been rising fairly dramatically, and we're up to close to about 100,000 demonstrations a year in China. And one of the things that has actually made things more volatile in China are cell phones and text messaging, because it's capable of mobilizing people fairly quickly. So the question is, what are they fighting over? One of the big issues is the unfair seizure of lands. Basically, corrupt government officials in league with industrial developers. Sounds like Orange County. No, just kidding. Yeah, it's a global village. That's great. It's very common for businesses to work with corrupt officials, basically to take land from Chinese and not compensate them properly and not give them a place to stay. I mean, the Three Gorges Dam is like the poster child of that. They had to move over 2 million people off the land. But there's a scary vignette in the book about how one village woke up to find that its land had been sold out from under them by the council that governed the village, which was appointed by the party and sold out. So that's a big touch point. And I mean, they're losing land just left and right to factories. Factories come in and pollute, and they ruin the land. I mean, that's a huge, 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 huge issue. So that's a biggie. Another is the regional income disparities. I mean, we're seeing, hey, look, what Chiang Kai-shek got run out on a rail from China in one of your upheavals, basically because he brought in democracy to China and promptly used democracy to get in league with business and feather their nests while the peasants basically had to eat cake. It was kind of a Marie Antoinette kind of thing. I mean, the same thing's going on today. The only difference is that the new elites are the Communist Party. I mean, the Communist Party, if you're a member of the Communist Party, that's like a license to steal. Okay, it really is. And so peasants work really hard, they get taxed really heavily, and they see their bureaucrats sending their kids off to UCI or sending, riding around in big expensive cars. So that's a touch point. In the cities, there's construction workers that don't get paid. They get room and board, but they get their wages withheld. That happens all the time. There's the slave labor conditions. There's the pensions, the Gray Panther issue coming up. So there's a whole lot of upheaval. And one of the reasons why China is running amok is because it has to keep everybody employed. I mean, as long as the gravy train keeps running down the track, no matter how many bad things it might be throwing off, it seems to work. But, I mean, if they have a significant recession, say after the Olympics, or any kind, the Three Gorges Dam collapse, something, yeah, I mean, we could see craziness again in China really easily. All right, who's next here? Okay, he's got the mic.
My question has to do with what do you foresee happening as a result of these observations? And some of the key points I think you mentioned is, number one, our indebtedness to China will increase so severely that sooner or later we have to pay a bill. And the fallout of that is extremely significant. The second thing that you haven't mentioned, but since China is evolved from a set of very primitive development, it has very little contact with Western civilization. Their thought processes aren't anything like our thought processes, nor are their ethical processes the same at all. And the language complexities they have to communicate with each other, and the verbs that they use and the nouns are totally different from what we use. And so my real question is, this confrontation, you can almost anticipate. What's your view on how this will be resolved?
What's the solutions? Yeah. Boy, I have a chapter in the Coming China Wars at the end, which kind of lays out all the possibilities. Feel free to read that. But it's got to start with a recognition that there's a problem. And I don't think we're there yet. I just don't think we as a country are there yet. And we're a parochial people. And we have a political leadership which, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how smart Congress is sometimes. You kind of, if you think about how you run for office, in this country, basically what you do is you spend all your time asking for money. You don't spend all your time thinking about issues. You spend all your time asking for money. All right, let's go here. Yeah, and then we got one last one, and we'll get you all home.
I have two questions. And the
two
first,
questions?
No, I think they're good, though. Mentioned earlier that the Chinese people are patient. They can wait a long time. However, with the fast-paced development of the manufacturing part of their economy, seems like that demand's really going to outstrip supply, especially of those oil reserves. When are the oil reserves that they're purchasing going to run out? And if I were Venezuela or Iran, I think I would not be very willing to pay the Chinese bill when it comes due. So what's going to happen with that situation?
Well, I'll tell you what China's trying to do. What China's trying to do is, in the jargon of my profession, is to move up and across the value chain. Okay, they started out as low on the value chain as assemblers, and their goal eventually is to build civilian aircraft and automobiles, which they're already doing, sophisticated medical equipment and all of that. In order to get that, they need our technology. And then across the value chain is the manufacturing, but it's also the marketing, the design, and all of that.
That was the second part of my question is, does it look like they're going to go the direction of, say, India with developing their...
No, they're not. They're sticking with a heavy manufacturing model, but what they're going to do, basically, is they're going to try to dominate the higher value-added ends of the manufacturing model. Like I said, aircraft. And instead of just making them, they design them and things like that. So, and the key part of that, of course, is forced technology transfer. That's the deal you make when you go to China. You You can have our markets access some, and you give us your technology. And then, as this woman so eloquently put it, as soon as they don't need you anymore, you're out the door. All right, last question. Now, look, the camera. Let's get the camera on this, gentlemen. This is pressure. This is big pressure.
Well,
the last question, it has to be the best question.
I am getting a little
panning
nervous.
the crowd here. Okay.
I am getting a little nervous with that. A while ago you said that we should be a friend and help them and that we should use tough love.
Yes, sir.
And while I have questions about how we would tell somebody to not trade guns for oil or trade veto power for political favor, you have certainly shaken me up with your drastic story, which I believe. What can we do?
Well, look, the foundation of any democracy is the grassroots and the people. And you just need to just spread the word. Talk about this issue. I mean, we need to move Iraq not off the front pages, but we need to at least move it side by side. And the funny thing it is, I sound like a pimp for the Financial Times, but I mean, that newspaper, if you read that newspaper, okay, I can assure you Paris Hilton is not on the front page. See, I'm a little disappointed in this crowd because the only time I got an applause when I mentioned Paris Hilton. And with that, hey, look, you've been a great audience. I'm going to turn it back over to the moderator here. I'll be out signing books for you. Thanks so much.
Professor Navarro will be out there. He'll be having his book out there that you can buy, and he'll be signing them. I'm going to get mine signed. But I am happy to see that there actually was a solution. I was a little bit overwhelmed. We'll just sell for $1 trillion in bonds, Paris Hilton, to the Chinese, and it'll all balance out. Anyway, we're going to do this again next week. Sandy, why don't you come up and tell us what's going on?
Well, first of all, let's thank Michael for being the ultimate host and bringing it all into closure and into perspective here. Beautiful, wonderful. And Professor Navarro, where are you? What an evening. It was amazing. Next week, I'm here to give you an invitation to meet us on Wednesday morning, and we'll have a little subtler morning. We're going to be here with Diana von Wentworth, the founder of the Inside Edge, to talk about something near and dear to her heart, the world of food. Something near and dear to all of our hearts. She was a long-running TV host of a show called The New Way Gourmet. She was known as the Traveling Gourmet and has traveled around the world getting recipes, tasting things, bringing it all to us so we can learn about herbs and spices and vegetables and meats and fruits and cheese from around the world. So be here and we'll bring it all together. Thank God we're possibility thinkers here. Huh, Michael?
You bet. Thank you, Sandy. So let me just remind you on your way out that Professor Navarro will be out there. You can have your book signed. Do we sell these CDs right here at the back? If you know someone that needs to hear this talk, you can buy one of the CDs and send them to us. Any of you that were guests here, you're welcome. You're also welcome to come back if you want to try us out. Basha Christ will be out at the front desk. There's these feedback cards. You can give us feedback, let us know how we're doing or what we're not doing well. And overall, I would think, isn't it wonderful to be in the presence of a great mind who's done this sort of research? And I would say, the thing I would take from this is start the dialogue. Thank you for, I haven't been doing this for long. Start the dialogue. See you all next week.